Any human activity nearby?
How should I know? The shell sensors are useless.
That little shell suits you, Joey.
Get lost, Foster. It's awful. Find me a new one.
Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Beneath a Steel Sky, one of the more unusual games I've ever encountered while doing this show. Now don't get me wrong, at first glance this looks like some sort of weird graphic adventure set in the future, and while that's technically correct, you need to seriously emphasize the word weird.
Gonna finish on that plastic.
Lovely piece of lamination.
Isn't it just?
I can tell you're proud of it.
Oh yes. They don't make clipboards like this anymore.
The thing is, this is a game which tries to set itself up as having a serious story, and as you play through it, the seriousness is continually being refreshed at certain points. But at the same time, it's also completely off the walls in terms of character interactions, dialogue choices, and even just what you're expected to do to survive. It's also an incredibly inconsistent game, which kind of gets in the way of trying to enjoy it at all. I mean, here, right at the very start of the gameplay, I got stuck because I'm on a catwalk, there's a door I can't open, and if I even try to attempt to go down the stairs, I get killed, and there's nothing to interact with up here. I mean, I'm scrutinizing every pixel I can. No matter how long I do this for, I still haven't been able to find anything that... Are you freaking serious? This quote-unquote rung has a hitbox that's only a mere 3 pixels tall, and furthermore, a rung? A rung of what? A rung of a ladder? What ladder? Also, why is my inventory calling this a metal bar? And then why is the description of this item referring to it as a crowbar? I mean, which is it? A rung, a metal bar, or a crowbar? These are all very different things from a logic perspective and could all serve different purposes considering. But as a result of this inconsistency, some of the puzzles don't make nearly as much sense as they should. And all the moments I got hung up were all because of this kind of language nonsense going on.
Oh yes, it was most instructive. From now on, whenever I smell raw sewage, I'll think of you, Gilbert. This could be the most stupid thing I've ever done.
Beneath a Steel Sky was developed by the UK studio Revolution Software, was originally published through Virgin Interactive in 1994, and is a one-player inventory-based adventure game. It runs in an MCGA 320x200 256-color graphics mode, and supports a small number of sound devices, but for digitized sound effects and voices, you must have a Sound Blaster card. As for its current release date, this was actually one of the first commercial DOS titles to go freeware many years ago. In fact, it was a very early title supported by ScumVM. Thus, the free releases on both GOG and Steam use ScumVM by default and do not include the files necessary to run this in DOSBox. However, there is one website out there which does indeed have a free DOS native release available, and it happens to be the RGB Classic Games website at www.classicdosgames.com, which is kind of surprising given that particular website hasn't been in the best of shape lately. If you want a physical copy, it's not hard to acquire one, as they're not even remotely rare, but there's multiple different releases to consider, including releases for different regions, Amiga releases versus DOS releases, floppy disk versus CD-ROM releases, so it's a bit of a nightmare trying to find the exact copy you want. Though for the most part, they all at least identify if they're for DOS or Amiga computers on the packaging. There's also technically a Mac OS release, but it came out after the game went freeware, and I believe it uses ScumVM, so I'm not entirely certain if it was an authorized release or not. I just know it exists because I've seen photos of the box for it. In any case, none of the CD-ROM based releases are even remotely rare, and so you should be able to get one loose for about $5 to $10, but fully boxed, you're going to find the prices fluctuate wildly, typically between only $15 or as much as $150, and I can't really find any reasons for this happening. A fully boxed copy also comes with a bunch of extras, including a short comic book detailing the introductory part of the story, and a couple other interesting things. But again, the prices are so wild, you might as well just just wait to find one for a reasonable price. That said though, I wasn't able to find a single floppy disk release for sale, which doesn't surprise me as the CD-ROM version with the added voice acting came out very shortly following, so if that's the copy you want, you may have quite the wait ahead of you indeed.
Oh, I see evil, evil born deep beneath the city, far from the light of day. I see it growing safe beneath a sky of steel.
Something I need to point out right away is that even if you don't have the short comic book which originally came with this game, it kinda doesn't really matter, at least with the CD-ROM version, as it has the entire comic without speech bubbles and fully voice acted, leading the introduction of the game. To summarize, this game takes place in a dystopian future where all that remains of humanity are enormous cities which stretch far into the sky, each rivaling each other for what few precious resources still exist in the world, like clean air. More specifically, the immediate story focuses on part of Australia, where the area between each city, dubbed The Gap, is considered highly unlivable, though tribal factions have formed within them. The main character we follow for the story is one Robert Foster, or at least that's what he's been called for most of his life out in the Gap, where he was the sole survivor of a helicopter crash. Now it's many years later, and during a sort of ritual to predict the future, it's suggested that an evil is coming in that very moment for Robert. And sure enough, seconds later, the group is assaulted, with the assailants demanding that they take a certain someone into custody who doesn't belong there, or else they'll kill everyone. So Robert comes out of hiding and goes with them, only for them to ultimately detonate everyone anyways. During the trip back to Union City though, the helicopter Robert's in malfunctions and goes down, thus leading into the start of the game as Robert tries to escape the clutches of the security forces and subsequently figure out what the heck is going on. I should also quickly point out that if you're playing this in DOSBox, the sound effects and voice are incredibly quiet compared to the music and cannot be adjusted, though you can adjust the music volume. I have no idea if it's like this on real hardware, and I'm gonna hazard a guess that this isn't an issue in ScumVM. But it's something to keep in mind if you're playing the game in this manner, especially since your setting for the music volume is forgotten between play sessions. So, I've already mentioned the inconsistency in the gameplay. Well, right away, this game does a lot of weird things which take a bit to get used to. For starters, you typically left-click on something to look at it, and right-click to perform an action. But this only applies to things you can't talk to, in which case both mouse buttons will talk to a person. Furthermore, all conversations happen with the characters in predetermined locations, thus when you decide to talk to someone, both characters will walk into their assigned spots first and then begin talking. The whole thing with characters walking into place when you try to do stuff is also compounded by them getting in each other's way, and the game desperately trying to path around everything, sometimes unsuccessfully. Unfortunately, even though the game locks out your controls while it's trying to do this, there is a time limit that the movements must complete within. Otherwise, the game will give up and give control back to you without doing whatever it is you're trying to do, be it activate something, talk to someone, etc. The inventory is a bit of a bigger mess though. When you move your cursor to the top of the screen, your inventory opens. Once it's fully opened, all action in the scene pauses. The left clicking gives you a description of an item, but it only stays up for a couple seconds. Holding the left mouse button down will cause the description to stay up until you let go. Right-clicking will select an item to use, but at this moment, the inventory will no longer automatically disappear, nor will you go back to the standard mouse cursor automatically, nor can you go back manually. Once you select an item, you have to either attempt to use it on something, or click on a spot Robert can move to, as this will cancel using any items. Again, this isn't egregious, but if you don't know exactly what's going on, it can be a bit annoying to deal with. Now, one of Robert's best friends happens to be a robot personality named Joey, but Joey's fate in the opening comic was not ideal. As such, Robert ends up transferring Joey's personality around to different robot shells throughout the course of the game, which in turn affects how Joey's able to interact with the world and with Robert. Joey's also able to give you extra details about items from your inventory when you use them on him, as those details may be highly pertinent.
Give me an analysis, Joey.
It contains flour, water, vegetable oil, salt, egg, garlic, with glycerin and pig crumbs.
Oh, disgusting.
Speaking of pertinent, that's one thing that kinda bugs me with this game, but I at least understand why it works this way. There's a lot of things you can't do until you try to do them the wrong way. The thought being that until Robert understands the situation or knows a pertinent detail, he can't really act on that. The trouble is that this mechanic is a bit overused. For instance, if I want Joey to go into this storeroom, which people are not allowed to go into, you have to first attempt to go in and set off the alarms before the option to ask Joey to go in will be in his dialogue tree, even though just looking at this contraption should give anyone the impression that walking inside's a bad idea. Actually, to counter that with a point in the game's favor, there's no such thing as a Walking Dead situation, at least as far as I can tell. Now, anytime the game seems to allow you to enter such a circumstance, you're really not, as either the items you lost aren't actually used for anything, or there's a way to try something again. Though I think maybe if you get exactly this far without the light bulb, that might qualify, though this was pretty far into the game, and you get the light bulb pretty early, and it's kinda hard to miss, so I didn't want to play the entire game over just to try this out. All that said, you can totally die in this game, even right at the start at the hands of the security officer who has orders to take you alive. Because that makes sense?
There's one gone every minute, eh?
That'll teach him not to use stolen ID.
Yeah, let's talk about the writing next, because freaking heck, this game's tone's just all over the map. One moment you'll be dealing with a life or death situation where this guy gets freaking blasted in half, and the next you're chatting it up about how annoying it is to drop your ID card in porridge. Or another moment, some worker's getting killed in a nuclear reactor, but before that, we were talking with an insurance salesman about his policies? I should point out too, the humor in this game is very British, including swearing on rare occasions. Well, heck, in this particular person's apartment, we find a VHS tape entitled Pussies on Parade. It's just a bunch of kittens playing around. What, you pervs were expecting some TNA? Yeah, right. If that's what you want, this is the place you want to go. Not even kidding.
Why guard an empty cathedral?
I'm not guarding it exactly. I'm just standing here.
Preventing me from entering.
Yes.
But yeah, the language inconsistencies are a constant issue throughout the game. Now, I know the game supports multiple text languages, but if I'm choosing English as my text language, you'd think the English voice acting would match, and it often doesn't. Or sometimes there seems to be a huge discrepancy between what the game's asking me to do based on what I'm being told is present. For instance, in this room here, both buttons have to be hit simultaneously to advance the plot. So naturally, I'm trying this over and over again, thinking that maybe my timing for asking Joey to help needs to be perfect or something. But the problem is that the buttons are actually quote-unquote broken, and you need to use a wrench to loosen them so you can press them? Someone please explain to me how a button can even be manufactured in such a way that it can become so stiff over time that loosening it with a wrench fixes it? Actually, just as a fun aside, I somehow managed to break this puzzle rather badly at one point, and it not only brought up a dialogue message which wouldn't disappear, but it was saved into this state and was now permanently present on this screen even after leaving and coming back. Leave it to me to break a game in a way no one's likely ever seen.
All I've got are the clothes I'm wearing.
In that case, you'll require the Easy Pay scheme.
Yes, that sounds perfect.
Kidney, lung, or testicles.
One really neat aspect of the game, though, is the underlying mechanics with the computerized overlord of Union City known as Link, spelled L-I-N-C. Now, everyone in the city has a Link status, which determines where they can go and what they can do, with Link itself generally being responsible for figuring all of this out. However, about a third of the way into the game, you become able to access Link through a sort of virtual reality interface, while linked up with a particular identification card, which in turn determines what information you have access to, along with which secondary programs you can access to help probe deeper into the system. Again, really neat mechanic, but it unfortunately doesn't see a whole lot of usage over the course of the game. But the only other thing to mention is that, while the music in the game really isn't anything special, just serviceable, The graphics are for the most part extraordinarily well done. There are a lot of frames to all the animations too, and it all just helps set the tone and the mood of everything, even if said tone is a bit erratic. A part of why I'm bringing this up though is that, given the extreme effort put into the artwork, I find it curious that there's only one death screen, given that you can die in a fairly large variety of ways, and yet you always see the same death screen. I don't know, it's just something I found relatively lacking compared to how much effort was put everywhere else.
Tell me about your dandelion game.
Ah, it's brilliant. You get chased by these giant yellow weeds.
You mean dandelions are yellow? The gardener told me they were blue.
He's mad. He's not a real gardener.
So to finish things off, one of my Patreon supporters, Sima Vahainen, asked, after playing it, did you understand the game's mixed ambience, or did you feel there was tonal whiplash? My answer to that entire question is yes. I understand what they're going for with the weird mix of serious and comedy, but at the same time it felt very awkward trying to shift my brain between both modes so suddenly and frequently. Not helped with the interface itself just being a hassle sometimes. Did I enjoy it? Not really, but I didn't dislike it either. Overall, this game was a firmly neutral experience for me, and I imagine it probably will be for a fair number of people who run into similar interface issues, or are weirded out by the tonal shifts, or get annoyed by the inconsistency in the language and dialogue. But for everyone else into graphic adventures, the puzzles aren't super tricky, save for a tiny few which have a time limit imposed, in which case you need to go lightning fast to clear them, or a couple requiring pixel hunting for very tiny hitboxes. You can't enter a Walking Dead state as far as I can tell, and hey, the game lets you keep a lot of saves if you need them all. How many, you may ask? 999! Fun fact, each save is a little over 52 kilobytes large, as it saves the exact object state of all rooms in the game, so if you were to fill all 999 slots, your save data would take up nearly 51 megabytes. That's way bigger than the base game, not counting the voice data. But yeah, if you can adapt to the inconsistencies, there's nothing too terribly wrong here. But do be aware, there is the occasional spot of graphic violence, swearing, and nudity. We are much better off playing this in ScumVM. If you do decide to try it out in DOSBox, you'll want to set a fixed cycles count. Otherwise, there'll be very odd hiccups in the game's performance. I was using a setting of 20,000, though I think the game will run fine with an even lower setting, as there's a handful of animations which felt slightly too fast at this speed, but for the most part, this setting worked well enough. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next up, 2 weeks from now, will be a filler video on Saturday, March 12th, and while I still haven't decided what I want to do for the filler video, it's not due to a lack of ideas, as I have a bunch of filler content I want to get to over the course of the year. I'm just trying to decide which to cover first. Regardless, be sure to stay tuned to see what I've got in store.
What's your name?
It's Eduardo. Why?
You're Anita's contact, right?
How come you know so much?
She left a message on her card.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.